So we're the human experiment. I mean, there's nothing written in stone that we will continue to thrive on this planet. It looks like all signs are pointing to the opposite. We're in pretty dire straits. It's not just climate-wise. Look at all the systems that are interacting, and we've basically thrown numerous wrenches into the Earth's operating system. So this report educates people, lets people know some more of the details, but should we expect this report to change people's minds when numerous other reports have not?
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And I think most of you probably are at least generally familiar with the concept of climate tipping points, which are large-scale situations regarding the atmosphere or the biosphere, the currents that may become so unstable as to reach a new state that's much more difficult to control with catastrophic consequences. We're here today to talk about these tipping points, and the reason why we're doing that now is because a major report that was authored by over 160, believe it or not, scientists from all over the world was just released, the state of tipping points 2025. This is their second report. They issued one in 2023, and I had the opportunity to attend their major conference this summer in Exeter, UK, where they talked about what these tipping points are and tried to get information to lead to a better and stronger report. The Climate Emergency Forum was able at that session to do two programs that I'd just like to mention briefly. One is with the esteemed scientist Johan Rockström, who is the initiator of the Planetary Boundaries model, and we'll put a link to that report in the chat, and also Rob DeLay and Peter Bunyard, who I interviewed regarding their approach of large-scale forest and ecosystem restoration to literally cool the climate. So with that, what I thought I would start to do today before I introduce our regulars is to read the first couple of paragraphs from what a declaration they're asking scientists from all over the world to in fact sign. And so here's what it says word for word. The world has entered a new reality. Global warming will soon exceed 1.5 degrees C. This puts humanity in the danger zone where multiple climate tipping points pose devastating risks to billions, that is billions with a B, billions of people. Already, warm water coral reefs are crossing their thermal tipping point and experiencing unprecedented mortality, threatening livelihoods of hundreds of millions who depend upon them. Polar ice sheets are approaching tipping points, committing the world to meters, that is meters, not just inches or centimeters, of long-term sea level rise that will affect hundreds of millions. Every fraction of a degree of additional warming increases the risk of triggering further damaging tipping points. These also include the collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, sometimes known as the AMOC, that would radically undermine global food and water security and plunge Northwest Europe into prolonged severe winters. Together, climate change and deforestation also put the Amazon rainforest at risk of widespread dieback below 2 degrees C of global warming, threatening incalculable damage to biodiversity, disrupting rainfall patterns, and impacting literally millions of people in the region and worldwide. And I'm going to stop there, but that gives you a flavor of what we'll be talking about today. And so, as always, I'm happy to introduce our regular panelist, Dr. Peter Carter from British Columbia. Hello, Peter. You are an expert IPCC reviewer, a retired medical doctor, and the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute. Peter, I know you've been concerned about tipping points for quite a while. Give us your initial take on this report, what it says, and why we should be concerned.
Thanks, Herb. And yeah, you certainly gave us a taste of what this report has. And the huge warning that this report is. This year, in my opinion, we've had two of the very, very best ever climate change reports. This is one of them, and the other one is the boundary one that mentioned, which is called a planetary health check. These both reports are hugely moving forward on what has been the sort of sluggish science, in my opinion, for a while. So this is a major achievement. This report has everything in it, everything. I had to read through it more carefully than I've read through it before, but I was pleased to see it's got everything. It even has the word immediate, immediate comprehensive transition away from fossil fuels. This makes it not only the first report that has repeated this finding of the IPCC assessment, but the only science statement at all. This is great. This is most important. And they also say the single most important prevention measure is to phase out greenhouse gas emissions rapidly. So we're not hearing very much about fossil fuel emissions really anymore. So I was very happy to see that they nailed this one. They also mentioned the air pollution, the toxic, deadly air pollution effects of burning fossil fuels, and they put this at 8 million lives a year being lost from that air pollution. They cover the economics, they cover the governance, they cover the influence of the banks and the financial institutions, that they really, really do have everything. So this isn't really just a tipping points report. This is a great report on climate change in general. They talk about a massive redirection of finance away from fossil fuels into clean energy. They also, of course, go into deforestation. I should mention that this has been rather a long time coming. Tim Lenton, who is the lead on this paper, Tipping Points, has done tremendous work because his first paper on tipping points was published in 2008. And that one had all the major tipping points that Herb's just mentioned. It had them all. So it's been a great mission and work of Tim and a few of these scientists that have really now brought this to the fore. What it amounts to, what they're saying is that we have fossil fuel industrialization and food production. They've got food productivity in there as well as a source of greenhouse gases. We have tipped all the tipping points, right? We're not looking any longer at, oh dear, we might tip tipping points. They're tipped, right? 1.5C and 2C is the numbers that are mentioned over and over and over here. We're certainly at 1.5C. Obviously, we're going to go above 2 degrees C, and that's definite because James Hansen is right. Working on radiative heat forcing, we are at 2.4 degrees C. So this is, I don't know what you call this, a hyper emergency, a mega emergency, but everybody really has to get onto this report and the other report I mentioned and communicate it. There's one little item that I would take a little bit of issue with, and it's rather important because it's the Arctic summer sea ice. I think we've known for decades that the very worst impact and definite impact of global surface warming is triggering all the massive Arctic feedbacks, amplifying feedbacks. And that's a cascading interaction situation, which is a road to total collapse. Now, the IPCC, in 2008, Tim Lenton had Arctic summer sea ice. But since then, the IPCC has come to the ridiculous conclusion that there's no tipping point for Arctic summer sea ice because it's reversible. Absolutely ridiculous and so terribly misleading. Now, in the cryosphere map, on the cryosphere section, they do have, I was very glad to see, Arctic summer sea ice as a tipping point. And I regard that as the tipping point of all tipping points because the huge amplification of global surface warming that occurs when the Arctic finally goes, which isn't far away.
Thanks, Peter. The question about the summer sea ice is, to some degree, it's kind of a definitional issue because I don't think anybody would say that it's unimportant if it goes. It'll be catastrophic, and it's going. We've had Peter Wadhams on a number of times to talk about that and other folks here. I also just wanted to mention to those who are watching that at the end of this program, like many of our recent programs, I'll be giving a quick update on some key climate news that occurred in the last few days. I'm always happy to introduce and have our regular guest and panelist, Paul Beckwith. Paul is a climate system scientist who lives in Ottawa, has taught at universities in the Ottawa region, has a YouTube program with over 1,600 videos on every aspect of the climate crisis. And I know you have been very vocal and involved and diligent in looking at tipping points in your work, Paul. What's your assessment of this report?
Thank you, Herb, and thank you, Peter, for your great comments. Well, I mean, clearly, as Peter sounds like a bit of a broken record sometimes when he says we've got to cut fossil fuel emissions, we have to slash fossil fuel emissions. I mean, fossil fuel emissions are still rising. I just heard on a previous call that Alberta's premier at this very moment in Saudi Arabia meeting with oil executives there. Fossil fuel emissions, it looks like humanity is just going to keep burning them and burning them until we run out. And by that time, temperatures will be much, much higher. We're seeing large temperature spikes. Things are anything but normal. We passed 1.5 Celsius. We'll be passing 2 degrees Celsius onwards to 3 degrees and up, on our present trajectory. One of the big problems is that as the fossil fuels are continuing to be burned and emissions continue to rise, the natural sinks on the earth seem to be failing. So we're getting less CO2 being absorbed in vegetation. I'll mention the boreal forests across the northern hemisphere. It's vital for these to extract CO2, to have a decent, healthy collaboration with fungi in the roots. As you can see from a previous video that we did, fungi levels are down about a third over a few decades, and therefore the forests are absorbing much less CO2, and they're under great stress from wildfires. Droughts are a big problem in the Amazon rainforest, where the COP is going to soon. So vegetation is just absorbing less CO2, therefore there's more ending up staying in the atmosphere. The oceans are, of course, warming. There's marine heat waves. They're stratifying. Warmer water cannot dissolve as much gas, so there's less CO2 that is being put away by the oceans in the sink. Less being dissolved, less descending to the deep ocean floor because the ocean circulation patterns have been changing along with the atmospheric or circulation patterns, the jet streams, which is most prominently reflected in the extreme weather events that we're seeing around the planet. Peter's mentioned the Arctic, the great warming of the Arctic, the loss of sea ice. There's a tremendous loss of snow cover, so the Arctic is much darker than it was before. That goes with the rest of the planet because of the tipping points of fewer clouds. And also, Antarctica is very worrying with the rapid collapse of sea ice there. So, it's vital that I can bring up the three-legged bar stool or the triad. We need to figure out ways to extract large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere-ocean system. Of course, as you know, I'm a big proponent of the necessity for solar radiation methods to cool the planet. People often talk about societal tipping points. Can society realize the problem and turn on a dime and change? And that's a bit of a pipe dream at the moment. The bright spark, which I've mentioned often, is the clean energy development and deployment from China. This is electric cars, batteries, wind, solar, electrification of grids. I mean, they're doing more than the rest of the world combined. But there are negative societal tipping points as well. So I want to mention one of the primary ones, which is the the rich poor divide in our society. We're now talking about not just having somebody with $500 billion, but up to $1 trillion. Are we going to get trillionaires? And as we get more and more billionaires on our planet and more, possibly trillionaires in the future, there's been numerous studies that show as people accumulate, there's no upper limit, first of all. When people accumulate vast amounts of money, it's sort of like a game to them to increase it even more. So there's no upper limit. Their influence on elections, of course, is enormous. Political parties are getting elected saying they'll help the regular person on the street, and then they go and do the exact opposite. So we have a huge problem with the way we structure our society. I think this doesn't end well. And of course, climate stresses everything on the planet. It stresses that as well. But we're seeing there's a sense among a lot of people that things just are not right in the way we govern ourselves on this planet. And history shows that these things just don't end very well.
Thanks for that uplifting comment, Paul. But certainly a not unwarranted one, that's for sure, given anybody who samples a selection of our previous programs on virtually every topic having to do with the climate emergency will not have a hard time reaching a similar conclusion to that Paul just reached. A couple points I'd like to make, and then I'll turn it back to Peter. One is, people might be asking, are we just looking at tipping points now? And first of all, the science is very difficult and is still in process. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty with respect to what are tipping points and just when can you tell if a snowball is going to go down the side of a mountain or an avalanche. It's extremely difficult. And it's very heartening to see that there are hundreds of scientists all over the world employing all sorts of different techniques to begin to get answers. That's sort of the first point I wanted to make. A second, though, related to that is that until, oh, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the consensus seemed to be that most of these tipping points would not be activated or tip until we got to 4 or 5 degrees C, and which gave us a little bit more time and a lot more time, decades more. And as the science has gotten more precise, unfortunately, the answers have been more dire. That, as this report shows, there are multiple tipping points that may have already, as Peter said, have already tipped. In many cases, we don't really know for sure. And those that aren't, most of them are on the verge of a risk of tipping at 2 degrees or not much more than that, or in some cases less than that. So our margin of error for the survival of humanity has narrowed and narrowed. At the same time, our ability to reduce our emissions and take other necessary steps has been pretty minimal. So with that as a little additional context, Peter, any additional thoughts you have?
I have pretty convincing reasons why all of these tipping points have been tipped, and that's how we have to look at them. We have to look at this issue. They've been tipped. We have to respond immediately, as this excellent report says. In addition, the report mentions that the risk of triggering major tipping points happens above 1 degree. So we're not just talking 1.5 or 2, we're talking 1. And that's quite right. I remember a few years ago that James Hansen wrote a paper in which he argued that 1 degree C was in actual fact the danger limit. And indeed it is, and we're far into it. I want to repeat that 2.4 degrees C, Hansen's right again, is what we are at, the amount of heat in the system. I also want to mention that one of the many good things this paper has is on permafrost. It's a very accurate and another emergency situation in which they say that permafrost is thawing, and permafrost thaw is irreversible. That's been established for many years now. That is irreversible, and that emits methane. It's doing so, emits CO2, it's doing so, and it emits nitrous oxide, it's doing so. So then I'll go back quickly to what most scientists, I guess, are focused on, and that is the sea level rise. I don't think that's the worst of our problems by far, but the West Antarctic ice sheet, that's destabilized, and we've known that for some years. NASA in 2014 published, for me, a real wake-up article that the NASA scientists have concluded that it's too late for the West Antarctic ice sheet. So Paul probably knows better than me how many feet or meters that is. I think it's 14 feet. Anyway, it's a hell of a lot. And with regards to their statement on the ice sheets, we have this paper earlier this year, which was entitled 1.5 degrees C is too much for polar ice sheets or something like that. So that applies to all of the ice sheets. I mean, we've known that about Greenland because in the 2014 IPCC assessment, they put the range of risk for Greenland being irreversibly going to be lost into the sea at 1.5 degrees C, and that's quite right. Finally, I'll repeat that it was very, very good that the report got a lot of publicity on the coral reefs. The coral reefs, my friends, they're gone, right? The fossil fuel industry, the other industries, They have wiped out the coral reefs. Our children will not see coral reefs apart from on movies. And we've known this also a long, long time. We've known that at 1.5 degrees C, the latest is, and that goes back to 2018 and further, over 70% of coral reefs, they're gone, right? They won't recover, they won't come back. And at 2 degrees C, the number is 99% loss of coral reefs. People, let's get some heart into this. Let's wake up and respond to this terrible, awful situation, right? And push our governments to stop subsidizing and wiping out the future.
Thanks, as always, for your eloquent plea, an entirely right on plea, Peter. You know, when you mentioned about the coral reefs sort of being pronounced as having reached its tipping point, and that did get a lot of press. I checked on that, and this report got a fair amount more press than climate reports usually get, from what I could see. But I want to make one observation when I take a look at the press that it got when it was released several weeks ago. It's what I would call one and done, one story, and then nothing else. In other words, it just fades away, and the ongoing sagas of our, our TV stars and our crazy politicians and everything else, that's what hits the newspapers every day. This makes a report for one day in CNN or some of our major newspapers, and then it vanishes from sight. And we're doing our best, small as it may be, to try to keep I don't know if we can keep 1.5 alive, but at least we can try to keep the tipping points report alive through our work and the work, hopefully, of others who were watching this. And with that, let me turn it back to Paul for any concluding comments you have.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, West Antarctic ice sheet, I always remember it. It's got about 5 meters of embedded sea level rise in it, which is about 16 and a half feet. So Peter's numbers was, yeah, about 16 feet plus just from West Antarctica. So I think there's been emphasis that we've known about these things for a long time. So then the question is, if we've known about them for a long time, why have we continued to ignore them? And we're continuing to ignore them because a report of this magnitude comes out, and as Herb said, it makes the news. It gets maybe on CNN for one day, and then it's just lost in the stream of constant news that people are exposed to. And a lot of that, more and more of that news, of course, is coming from AI generated articles and illustrations, figures, and stuff. As the quantity of news that hits us increases, the accuracy of the news that we're seeing is declining. You literally can't believe your own eyes when you see illustrations come across, pictures, for example, come across the web. It's manipulated, it's clearly manipulated, these news cycles. We know who is getting really good at manipulating it. I guess a lot of people feel powerless. They feel, unless you're a politician and then maybe you can set policy, but there's not a stomach for humans to change their behavior. So the coral reefs vanish. Okay, they vanish. Well, what happens? What are the after effects? Sea level rises. Well, move inland. Like, our species is just not behaving like a rational species to preserve our ecosystem. I don't see this as being, is this a negative thing? Well, it's not great for us. It's not great for humanity, but the Earth will go on. I call it the human experiment. We haven't been on this planet for very long. We were hunter-gatherers for the longest period of time. We started to organize and build villages and build cities and expand our numbers greatly. I was very interested in a recent report on global population, and they say that the 8.2 billion is a huge underestimate because people in rural areas are not counted properly. Just to give you an idea, the study actually looked at areas that were flooded by water from dams being built. They had population census on number of people in these rural areas, and then the dam was built, the area was flooded, people had to flee, and in order to get insurance and so on, they had to count them, and the numbers invariably were much higher than what we thought. So that 8.2 billion is probably a huge underestimate if you look at this data. So we're the human experiment. I mean, there's nothing written in stone that we will continue to thrive on this planet. It looks like all signs are pointing to the opposite. Is this, am I being negative saying this? No, I don't think so. I'm just looking at the research and, basically conveying to people what it says. I don't think it's a judgment whether do I hold back and not tell people what it is? Well, that's not how I operate. I call a dime a dime. So we're in pretty dire straits. It's not just climate wise. Climate, of course, is exacerbating everything else, but look at the big picture here. Look at all the systems that are interacting, and we've basically thrown numerous wrenches into the Earth's operating system. So this report educates people, lets people know some more of the details, but should we expect this report to change people's minds when numerous other reports have not? I don't expect to see it myself, but prove me wrong.
Well, I certainly am not in a position to prove you wrong, nor would I attempt to. I don't know that, we haven't found the key to the lock to unlock the sort of the secret potion that enables humanity to treat this the way we would a war. You've heard that expression. I don't know who first said it about looking for the moral equivalent of war. And climate is the moral equivalent of war in terms of the need to mobilize. And yet we don't, and we haven't. In fact, there's some research that suggests that when there are disasters, like in Spain, when they had tremendous flooding and disasters last year, I think it was, the research afterwards showed that people were less likely to be wanting to act on climate. They were so angry at the political leaders and so manipulated, as both of you have said, about by the mass media and the not mass media, that they actually were less inclined to move on climate. All bets are off in terms of what moves people. And I expect and hope that we'll do a program that focuses just on that question of what moves people sometime in the near future, because that is really, at the heart of what this is all about. We can continue and do 200 more programs, and hopefully we will. I think we're all dedicated to do that. But the key is how do you get information and experience to translate into action? I wanted to thank you both, Paul and Peter. I wanted to mention one more really important component of this report that may get overlooked, but to me, it's maybe the most important, and that is the fact, and I'll read it here. It has to do with the interactions between these climate systems. They're not in isolation. When the AMOC goes, that's going to affect Greenland and vice versa. And what happens in the Amazon doesn't stay in the Amazon. And the more we research, the more we see how interconnected the world is, both physically as well as in communications. So what the report says is that out of 20 climate tipping system interactions assessed, most of them are destabilizing, meaning the interactions between them are making them worse. But there are a few, and we could talk about that another time, that may actually help stabilize things, but they're few and far between. And then they say, and I'll just wrap up with this, that the AMOC, which is the Atlantic, ocean currents in the North Atlantic, the AMOC is the key global mediator of tipping point interactions, featuring in 45% of all assessed tipping point interactions, which suggests maybe simplistically that we really need to focus on the AMOC and not to the exclusion of everything else. But it seems to be, from what this report says, the central tipping point that will have impacts on all other tipping points and lead to a vicious cycle where once one thing tips, like the house of cards, everything then tips. So with that, thanks to Peter and Paul, and let me wrap up with a few quick headlines from the news in the climate world this past week or so. Well, we've talked, as Paul has today, about the third part of your stool and the SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, or other forms of solar radiation management. There was a study that was just done that for those of you who love your coffee and your chocolate and your wine, that SAI looks like it may not be able to help those crops survive as temperatures get warmer. So I would say eat, drink, and be merry tonight as you read this, and don't wait for tomorrow. Brazil, under the new president, has, who ran on a platform of reducing the damage to the Amazon, and they announced that their emissions last year were declined by 17%, which they attribute to a significant reduction in the deforestation of the Amazon that occurred during the previous president, who basically said, burn baby, burn, chop baby, chop. So that's a little bit of interesting good news. In Australia, there was an announcement that they're going to have a nationwide program to give everybody, whether you have solar panels or not, 3 free hours of solar electricity every day in the afternoon to encourage people to use electricity at that time when solar is at its maximum in terms of it being generated. So I thought it was a very interesting and important experiment. Getting back to what was just said previously about Antarctica, there's a glacier called Hectoria, Hektoria, which was just found to have retreated by 8 kilometers in 2 months. That's probably faster than I can run. And then we have, for those of you who are passionate about the Arctic bumblebee, rising temperatures could affect, there's a particular muscle in the Arctic bumblebee that generates its characteristic buzz, and rising temperatures may well reduce the amount of buzz that we get from Arctic bumblebees. One of the maybe more insignificant, but thousands of impacts of climate change. Then I don't know who got the grant to study that one, but there it is. The United Nations General Secretary has acknowledged more or less, well, in fact, not even more or less, acknowledged that 1.5 is in the rearview mirror for the first time. Those of us here will not be going to Belém, but it'll be interesting to find out if there are any signs or slogans or songs that still say keep 1.5 alive or not, because the UN Secretary General has pronounced its death, if you will. There was a Dutch election very recently, some of you may have heard about, that was won by a party that people didn't expect to win the election, and that party is led by the former climate minister. So good news for the likelihood that the Netherlands will become more aggressive in their climate action. And lastly, in sub-Saharan Africa, a study came out that said that children are 77% more likely to be at risk of serious cases of malaria for every 1 degree C increase in temperatures. So there's a direct correlation between temperatures, disease, and death and despair. So with that sort of mix of good news, bizarre news, and some not so good news, as always, I want to thank all of our guests and Charles and Heidi for putting this program together. Please like this program, subscribe to our channel, go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org, and when you see that round donate button, don't hesitate to move your finger in that direction, because we could use at least a little bit of support to help us continuing to offer well over 200 programs on every aspect of the climate crisis. Please leave us your comments about today's program. Leave us your suggestions for future programs. And as always, we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Bye.